The human story is the search for belonging. From childhood to adulthood, in joy and in struggle, we all sit in questions of how to make sense of it all. What is our place? Why are we here? What is our story of searching? Join us in conversation with community members, each sharing some of their own story. I am Ben Spratt, and this is Belonging. It is such an honor to get to be sitting with a beloved friend and someone that I admire fully in mind, in heart, and in soul. And Neal Shapiro is probably one of these individuals that really doesn't need an introduction. But just to give a brief word, Neal has worked in media for more than 40 years. He spent time working at ABC News, was executive producer at Dateline NBC, president at NBC News, and then actually journeyed to become the CEO of WNET, known for most of us as 13. And during his 40 years in media, the number of awards, of Murrows, of Emmys, of every award under the sun, I probably are innumerable. Maybe you have a count somewhere. But it's in that time period that everyone that I know that in your professional life has encountered you has spoken about your integrity, your courage, and a heart that always reaches for goodness, Neal. In the context of Roda Shalom, you have been a part of this community for almost 25 years now. You and Juju have raised your three amazing boys, Jared, Travis, and Mason here. We've had the chance to weep together, to laugh together, to celebrate together, and so many moments in between. I cannot imagine a voice that we need to hear more of and a heart that we need to bring more into the center and to the spotlight than yours, Neal. Thank you for being willing to join us.
That's going to be easy to live up to, so go ahead.
Yep, there we go. So Neal, you've heard the podcast. This is about belonging, and would love if you'd be willing to tell us about your own search for belonging.
You know, I was thinking about, I joined ABC News in 1980. My first kind of big job in 1981 was to be assignment editor in Buenos Aires during the Falklands War. And my boss at the time said to me, you know, there are two things they hate in Argentina, and both begin with J. So I thought about the kind of Judaism and journalism and how much I think they're alike. And also reminding you that many times you're not a part of everybody else. And, you know, when I was growing up, I grew up in Albany in a comfortable middle-class home. And I'm not picking this up, in the town of Bethlehem. The name of the high school paper was the Bethlehem Star. And we sang Christmas carols in the high school choir. And there were not that many Jewish kids in the school. And when my parents moved to Albany, which is in the 50s, there were parts that the realtor said, you can't live here because Jews are not allowed in this part of town. My name is Neal Shapiro. My middle name is Barry. And my mother said, I gave you the middle name Barry because I thought one day if you went on television, you know, there's so much anti-Semitism. If you had to, you could drop Shapiro and you could still be Neal Barry and still work on television. So it's amazing that kind of in those early days that I thought about that. And then the other thing I thought about belonging is when you're not always a part of something bigger, it accentuates how important it is to belong to something which is smaller and makes you feel welcome. And Judaism has done that for me in my whole life, has made a place to feel welcome and a place of belonging and a place of purpose. And, you know, even sometimes when I go to synagogue, I do have this Sinai moment, right? Kind of here for a moment, like I'm lifted away from everything and I'm part of this larger effort, and that people around the world are saying the same prayer at the same time I'm saying it. And in journalism, there's something of that too. You know, if you think about natural disasters, there's always like a big high shot, and there's two lanes of traffic. And one lane of traffic is all the people fleeing from the disaster. And the other lane of traffic, much smaller, are the first responders, the people there to give help, and there are journalists there to document what's happening. In that smaller group, there's incredible pressure, incredible tension, but there's also part of this incredible feeling that we're going to do something together, that we're going to make the world better in our own way.
What would lead you to go and then choose another J in your life, to choose journalism that would then add another layer of standing a little bit on the outsides of things? What inspired you to take one minority identity and add on another one?
Part of it was I liked writing as a young age. Like I taught myself to type like at 7 or 8, and I would come home and write sports stories like just for me. So I knew I liked writing, and I liked doing that. And my parents, my dad was getting his engineering degree, but he was a labor organizer for the AFL-CIO. And my mother was a writer for the yearbook covering labor unions. So she went to interview him, and that's how they met. So I think there's something about journalism maybe that was in the blood. And then the other big thing that happened, I was the guy who always ran the high school paper and went on to do a lot of that. But Watergate was a big moment in my life. I remember I would duck out. The Watergate hearings were on during the day in the library, school library, and I would duck out and watch them. And I thought this was an amazing thing. And then I remember reading contemporaneously the New York Times and Woodward Bernstein and the Washington Post, feeling like this was an amazing thing. First, because history was unfolding in front of our eyes. But second, were it not for maybe, some crusading journalists in the Washington Post, we would not know about this. And, imagine kind of the abuses that might have continued had they not been stopped. And that was really because of the watchdog function of journalism. So that interested me. And then television interested me as the idea about, as much as I liked writing, I recognized, if you looked at two things, the ability to actually see something and the ability to put pictures and words together is such a powerful thing that if I could do it, that's what I wanted to do.
So as a journalist, and certainly a person who's been probably through every layer and facet, of journalism and media, true remarkable stories worth telling, stories worth listening to or watching, actually are very difficult, both to discover and also to discern how to deliver. And I'm wondering along the way, what have been the tools that have allowed you to know what are the things worthy of sharing? What are the things necessary to elevate? In times of scandal, how we can bring truth to power. And I know you were instrumental in the coverage of the Iraq War and many other moments of, I would say, human tragedy and heartbreak. How did you know? What are those tools that you bring to know this is the story that's needed and this is the way we need to bring it forward?
Well, part of it is, and I think it's not, once again, unrelated to journalism, right? Story is the basis for everything, right? It's the oral tradition that started our faith. It's the reason when we tell things, you can tell the same story in a really boring, flat way without any personality, or you can tell a riveting story, which is all about people. So at the end of the day, it's understanding first how to tell stories. I really got into movies as a young kid and really loved movies. Yeah. And what I took from my thought, trying to marry the best of movies, which is not real facts, but real architecture about characters, how to understand what they were about, understanding conflict, right? And the best stories, I think, I'm speaking to someone who knows this so well, are stories that touch you in two ways, that touch you in your head and your heart, right? That make you think and make you feel. And if you can marry those two together, and then you can attach it to some level of importance, those are the best kind of stories. Because then I think people take away from it not just the kind of, what must that have been like? What must it have felt to people? What were they thinking about? But then the larger issues of, what was important. And if you think about O.J. Simpson, that whole drama, a lot of people cover that in a lot of different ways. There was certainly just a perfectly interesting whodidit story which would run through that. But the things that made that more meaningful and I think had a lasting influence were the larger issues about what that story embodied, the inequality, how people viewed the police, the notion about police procedure and fairness and all those things. So that story wasn't just about O.J. Simpson. And O.J. Simpson, right, he's now gone. The large issues that unfurled and touched, those are the important things, I think, for journalism and society to think about, right? All those widow issues often touch bigger things.
So how do you, if the best stories touch mind and heart, it means also being willing to, as a journalist, I imagine, knowing what ignites your own mind and your own heart. How do you exist in your own heart when you are looking at, I'm sure, moments of great heroism and courage, but also 40 years swimming in stories that don't always just come with sunshine and rainbows?
Part of it is that I think it's what I liked about journalism. I was a debater in college, right? I was pretty good, fast on my feet. And my dad said, you should be an attorney. Partly because he thought this journalism thing will never work out. But in my college year, I was also a captain of the debate team. And I realized what I didn't like about it was I'd argued cases so often on so many different sides, and I was good at it, that by the end of the year I was feeling like I'm confused about how I feel about airbags because I've argued so many different times. And I didn't like that feeling. What I liked was thinking about the arguments, thinking about I'm going to make sure other people get to make the best decisions they can make. So one of the stories I did a long time ago, it was Primetime Live, was a story about the beginnings of the neo-Nazi movement in Austria. And a guy, Gottfried Kussel, I think was his name, who was getting a lot of attention in Austria a total Holocaust denier, spewing hatred, lived in a house surrounded by swastikas and odes to Hitler and all this stuff. And we interviewed him. But as I did this, I thought, I'm going to channel my internal rage and anger about this is, knowing that millions of people are going to see this. And after we aired it, it turns out he violated a bunch of laws in Austria, and he went to jail. And you know what? That was the ultimate feeling of accomplishment. What I did was took not just my personal anger, which I said is not part of the story, but I'm going to paint the picture of who he is and let other people make judgments in the trust that at the end of the day, for the most part, the more information people have, they'll make the right choices.
Mm. And again, I think many of us, look, I'm in a position where I'm standing in front of people and I'm saying things, and it's very easy to fall into the desire to say everything that comes out of my mouth is objective. I am naming the objective truth. And I think often we want to expect that of journalism, but I think what you're getting at is the inherent humanness of the way we tell stories, that there is not really a way to decouple our own mind and heart from the events of the world. And we're living at a time right now where it feels like identity purity has become so assumptive in how we look at the world. And it does not matter your political background, religious background, but this idea that if you are a thing, then you are this thing in its entirety. And there is no suppleness. There is no understanding. And we cast out anyone that bumps up against our understanding of this. So what does it mean to have our gender identity, our sexual identity, our national identity? And I look at the world of journalism where in many ways it is the opportunity to encounter different identities, different stories, different understandings of the world. And this does not seem to be a time where people bring curiosity of like, oh my goodness, wow, you've lived something different than me. I will learn that. It's instead, you live something different than me, you should be destroyed.
And not only that, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to read it. It's an affront. You would even put it in front of me. Right? I'm not even curious. Beyond curious. So I'm offended you would even put that in front of my eyes or let me hear it. That's a shame. I think part of the world we live in a world which is trending in all the wrong directions, in which people are first can choose the information they choose to get by people who get rewarded for just rewarding them. So we live in a media and algorithms which feed you down roads of hate and keep presenting you with things that just reinforce your points of view. If we could get to the point where even in the best of politics, when people could disagree but agree at least on humanity, they could agree that, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could have a drink at the end of the day and talk. And could actually get things done, though they fundamentally disagreed about a whole bunch of things, and they saw the world in very different ways. And we're losing that. And part of the reason we're losing that is because we are painting people as these cardboard figures. We don't want to see any complexity in them. What I'm scared about is in the way technology is going, right? We're constantly shaped by people who just tell you you're correct. And even if you are at that moment, the world is changing so much. Right, we should acknowledge the fact that even if, to whatever degree correct really means, even if you actually solved it, you've seen the world objectively, 1 second later it's a different world. The world keeps changing, right? And we need to make sure we're aware of that. And my hope is over time people are going to realize that we can't keep living in this world, that things are going to happen. A good example is climate change. Like climate change is, I think, getting to the point, not for everybody, but increasingly most Americans go like, wait a minute, the weather is out of control, but you can see climate change. You can see where it's happening. Right, so I'm not really interested in those debates anymore about is it real or not. It's real, right? And that issue itself is kind of shifting a little bit. It's becoming less polemic. I think that may happen with other issues too. I think as we reach issues where people like stop spinning, right? I really need to understand this. And if that's true, more people start to flock to say, I want information not just from my usual resources, and I want it from people not just in my neighborhood.
So how have you and Juju, since you're both in this world of story shaping and feeling, I would say, the fractures and the fires of this time, how have you nurtured your 3 boys, all 3 of whom are deeply loving, compassionate people, very curious people, looking at difference in the world as opportunity rather than threat? How have you nurtured that?
So first of all, I would say you should interview Juju because she is the real. She deserves so much credit for the boys. But having said that, I think as a couple, I think we do try to talk about how important it is not to judge people. Part of it is because she's often, especially she, but we're both bringing home stories about things we've done, people we've talked to. You know, that first of all, my kids are incredibly lucky. They would tell you they've lived incredibly lucky lives, and so it's not as if they faced a flurry of issues as some other kids. But having said that, even the very comfortable lives they've led, you know, one of them wrote his college essay about anti-Semitism in high school. I was like, what? And I remember telling them, in fact, that Skip Gates, who does a lot of shows for us, said this thing about there are two rivers that run deep through America, and one is anti-Semitism and one is racism. And it's always there, and it bubbles up at certain times, right? So don't be surprised. Like, it's there, something you will contend with. Even in the world of chosen children, that's still a thing. And I said this to my kids about why we don't have Christmas trees, right? I said, you know, it's important for you to know it's okay to have a holiday which isn't ours. It's theirs. There's nothing wrong with that. You can go help your neighbors set up their Christmas tree, but it's not your holiday, right? We have our own holidays. And it's important to recognize that at a young age, that's okay. You don't have to always be part of the crowd. And it will give you strength. It's given me strength to say, you know what, in my other life, to do stories which people haven't always liked, to get feedback which that people are angry about, and do stories that they wish some people think you shouldn't have done. They're like, you know what, I think it's the right thing. And I recognize I'm not always going to be appreciated by everybody. When I was in college, I did a story. My first story as a freshman, I did a story. And there was a huge story about mob influence in the area in bars. And the mob was shaking down people who had pinball machines in the bars. So I went to school and said, hey, how do we license pinball machines? They go, what do you mean license them? I go, well, where are our licenses? Well, we don't have any. So I wrote the story, and they took the pinball machines out of campus in one day, all gone. I was not the most popular kid. Right? Now, it turns out it took like 2 days to relicense them, and they all came back. And if they just followed the law, this wouldn't have been an issue. Right? And I still think I did the right thing, but you can't imagine how unpopular I was for a couple of days. But you have to have the character and the strength of, you know what, this is the right thing, and I'm going to stand by it.
Such an important point. I feel this. I'm just thinking in my own life. I'm thinking even this year. My son Jonah, who just finished fifth grade. This is a year where he starts to bump up against assumptions of what does it mean to be a boy. And he's a proud Swiftie, fan of Taylor Swift, and he had some difficult experiences this year where he not only chose to wear a Taylor Swift shirt and got the repercussions at school, but remember there was a day where he was deciding to talk about what it means to care for other people and what it means to love friends and love animals, and chastised for being by his peers for being willing to express his love. And I know I'm sitting with a fellow person who, like me, has tears that often can come up, and what it is to live with a big heart. And to live with a big heart means you are going to, at times, be stepping apart from the crowd. You're going to feel a wound that other people don't. To see that sometimes doing the right thing that may upset people for 2 days allows you to feel in alignment with something that says, no, that voice inside of you is something important. There is something in you that is worth solidifying and celebrating. And I think about the reach for belonging that many people have right now, and that reach is often from a cheap place. It's not doing the inner work of wondering, where is my heart in all of this? It's simply wanting to make sure the world sees I'm not alone. And so we'll rush off to align ourselves, to lock arms with somebody who may stand for something that's completely antithetical to our own heart, but do it because we think it's the only way to feel belonging.
And that actually is not a real sense of belonging, because eventually those things become frayed. There is no trust in that, right? Those kind of alliances will come and go, and often when they break apart, they're painful and destructive. It's much better, I think, to say, you know what, I am who I am. I'll find people who believe in what I believe in, and I'm okay. I can stand apart from people. And that, I think that reflects in all kinds of things, not just politics. The courage to say sometimes, I'm not going to do this. I'm okay not being a part of it, whether it's a foolish choice that some teenagers make. That's important to say, you know what? I'm not going to go to that party. I'm not going to do that thing. And it's okay.
Knowing that oftentimes, the way that stories affect us is that it both can give us a sense of resonance of what we've been through ourselves, but also prepare us and open ourselves to experiences yet to come. But we're living in a time where those third spaces where community is created are in rapid decline and have been for a long time. And we've talked about this together, the de-churchification of America, the rapid decline of churches and synagogues as spaces of gathering, and specifically places of gathering of diverse perspectives. has resulted in many people having no real physical place that brings them into contact with people that are different than them. And I'm wondering, for you, where do you see the opportunity rippling in America today? So, it's easy to focus on the pessimism, but if we no longer, or we have diminishing spaces, what gives you a sense of hope, or where do you see as the opportunity for us on the horizon?
I think there are some things which take us back to our minds, to things that can bring us together, which are not political. Right? So I think arts is a great thing. When there are things when we can see something. Taylor Swift's a good example, right? Someone just unbelievably talented. To me, that's a thing that says, can we find something, just the majesty of the human spirit, the creative mind, that works together, performances, art, whatever it is, to say, wait, I can stand apart a little bit from the debate about what we should do with the border, and I'm just going to appreciate this. And the other, which I think maybe, is increasingly there's a more attention being paid to local news, local events. There's a growth in news, in fact, in sort of smaller papers and digital things. And it could be that some of the larger feelings we have about, are you red, are you blue, what camp are you in, fall away when it's actually about who's going to fix the sewer system, right? What's wrong with the buses here, right? What do we do about the water pressure? And part of a community is actually hoping people can work together on smaller issues. I think about even things that we do here about hunger and things like that, which can be like, okay, we can step away from that and just look about the issues about humanity, right? We're all against hunger, right? We're all going to come together to try to do something.
I love that. I do think this idea of experiencing an immersive story that draws us in, that pulls us in, I think is an essential part of the human psyche. I mean, the most observed Jewish ritual in the world, of course, is a Passover Seder. And, for thousands of years, we've had this practice of telling the same story, but we tell it differently. What do? We sit down. For some people, it's 20 minutes. For some people, it's 6 hours. Right. And we tell this epic story. And it's a story that both feels completely other and alien. I at least in my world, I'm not seeing, seas splitting and, staves turning into snakes. Certainly getting to see some plagues of late and things. But it's interesting because in drawing us in, it plays into these universal human experiences, universal human tropes. I find to be one of the more helpful human moves is oftentimes when we feel most heartbroken in life, it's because we have only come to the first part of the story. And going back to your earlier point, the best stories have conflict, but it's often what comes on the other side of the conflict that gives the meaning and purpose and says that the conflict might have been worthwhile all along. And it's that patience of how do we look at a time where we may feel rupture in our world or feel betrayed and be willing to endure to see what happens after the 10th plague, to see what happens when we feel like we're caught between an army and an ocean. And, and I wonder for you, what are some of the stories right now that may not yet have bloomed fully into the public eye, but even just small stories that for you are letting you feel like there's something good that's starting to grow. There are some seedlings here. There's these little shoots of something that might be worth nurturing.
I think these kind of community developments, I see a lot of that. I think and I think there's also this generational thing. Years ago, I once we did a story about generations, and the new generations, I think, are reflections of different values. I think they're more giving. I think they're more concerned. I think they're more interested in work-life balance in a way my generation never was, maybe because it couldn't afford to be. It's all about, right, you have a job to do. Those are good values. I think, though it's often a headache for people like me, I think when people care about the values of the places in which they work, right, that's a difficult thing to sort out. But it's good that people say, I want purpose in my life. And that doesn't just mean, where I might find a singer. It means actually the job I have. I want to know I'm doing something good for the world. And I want to know my bosses are thinking about that. That didn't happen 30, 40 years ago. So it's complicated, but I think it's a good thing.
So I'm hearing you reflect, Neal, and I love that somehow you see the story moving forward. There are many people who are trying to tell the story of today as the story that we are moving backwards. There are many people today that are telling the story today that we should try to move the world backwards. And there's some scary things around us, and there's some precipice on either side, and we need to be watching where we're heading, but ultimately we're heading forward. And, I think about that long arc, and I'm just curious as a as a journalist who has covered things that are both in the micro element and tried to lift up stories that span years or even decades, how do you lift your eyes? How do you not just look in the retrospective? How do you not just see the precipice? How do you look at what's ahead of us? How do you keep that orientation? Because I think back over 20 years of us knowing each other, Neal, and I think about the conversations we've had. Always you make a move in our conversations to look up. And for me, who's not a journalist, what are the things that the rest of us could do to make that Neal Shapiro move?
You'd be a great journalist if you ever had you gone that way. I think you would have been a great journalist.
I don't know.
But I think there's a couple things. It's hard to untangle who we're all a product of all the different things we are. So I'm not sure which of those J's account of that. But I do think first part of being I think part of being a Jew is believing you can repair the world, or you're supposed to. I think part of being a journalist is believing that the stuff you do helps to make the world better. And I think understanding history is to say that the world it takes a while, but the world is slowly becoming a better place. When I was in college, I spent a lot of time studying the Soviet Union because I believed, as everybody did, it was going to be the long twilight struggle between us and the Soviet Union. That was going to be the world. And I studied Soviet economics and Soviet history and all those things. Flash forward to one day I was in Berlin on a story, and they called me and they said, you have to go to Berlin because the wall's coming down. I go, let me tell you something. The Berlin Wall is not coming down. And I went there, and guess what? I was there the night the wall crumbled. And the Soviet Union crumbled not long after that. Now, Russia's still a dangerous place, but it's not nearly what the Soviet Union was. And that idea that we'd be caught in that twilight struggle is not true. It didn't happen. It's not a clean line, right? Russia didn't instantly be transformed into a better place, but Russia today is much less menacing, even where we are now, than the Soviet Union was, right? And there's more freedom countries around it, and there's more sorts of democracy within it. I believe that's the way the world goes. And I believe part of it is understanding that at the end of the day, most people, not all, but most people, actually, there's goodness in them. Most people do want to do the right thing. That, if we try to make sure we can tap into that and help people find that within themselves, the world will slowly become a better place.
Well, I have to say, I think that should be the last word, my friend. I can't think of a more important lesson for us to be lifting up right now. And especially as we go into an election season at a time when many, irrespective of how this election goes, are going to be feeling a loss of belonging and pretty profound fear, to go back to how do we feel the humanity in everyone around us, to believe that ultimately there's some goodness in people around us. That is exactly the story that we need right now. So thank you. That was a gift that I needed. Neal, what a blessing to get to be in conversation with you, and what a gift to get to have all of the listeners here, get to hear a bit of your heart and your wisdom. Such a blessing. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you for inviting me. It was totally fun.
Such a joy. Thank you for joining us and listening to this story of belonging. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me on Twitter at Ben H. Spratt. For more information about CRS, visit us online at roadofshalom.org.